Welcome to Reading Between the Reels. I'm Matt Leader.
And I'm Craig Dickinson. Today on the show, we are looking at The Amazing Spider-Man Duology, the two films directed by Mark Webb. It was a reboot of the Spider-Man films after the Sam Raimi trilogy, which we covered in our last episode. And we're looking at, possibly seeing, well, actually, we know we're going to see some of the characters and themes from the series in Spider-Man No Way Home. So that's definitely one of the big reasons we're doing this episode today. So Matt, why don't you tell me and the audience what about your overall thoughts on the Amazing Spider-Man duology?
So overall, I was actually pretty happy with the movies. I think that they're very different than the Sam Raimi ones. The Sam Raimi ones are very corny. They're very campy. I think there's lots of good action. I think the web slinging is good, but they're also, these two films are very different. Where I really liked the first Amazing Spider-Man. The second one I had heard really negative things about, and it wasn't as bad as I had kind of heard it was. And so I went in with kind of a negative outlook, like going into the film, and I ended up enjoying it more than I thought I would. There were parts that were not great, and there were problems in Amazing Spider-Man 2. But overall, I quite liked the duology, and I thought that it provides an interesting opportunity that not a lot of films get, which, I mentioned on our last episode with the Sam Raimi trilogy that, like with comics, you have runs by different authors, different artists, and they'll work with the same group of characters, but the stories will be very different. And we don't really get that a lot with movies, comic book movies, but we do with Spider-Man. And so it's, at least for me, it's really fun to imagine these two, the Raimi trilogy and the Webb duology, as two separate comic runs. And I really enjoy that aspect of it. What are your overall thoughts?
No, I think that's a good way to look at it. That they're not competing, and it's okay to like both. But they do. It feels like, yeah, we do this. We get this in comics, where where one writer will take over from another, and then they kind of change some things up. Or we have, there's always reboots of the characters in comics. I know they've had it in Marvel too, but in DC, I think you're going to have all the crisis events where they basically restart the line. It's kind of the same idea you're getting here. I really like these movies too. The second one, we'll talk about why it doesn't quite work, but I really did like the first one a lot. I think that it's really smart that some of the things they did to differentiate from the previous movies, where you have, actually the story of where Peter's parents went. And I really enjoyed all that backstory, with them being, essentially secret agents almost. Right. And in the comics, they have been retconned as shield agents. And so I thought that was kind of a cool addition. And then also how, Peter's transformation is kind of predestined in a way, because it's directly related to his father's work. I thought that was a really smart way to go. I really like Andrew Garfield. That's my biggest takeaway.
I do too.
He's my favorite live action Spider-Man.
That's really interesting. I want to get into that a little bit, because I feel like Spider-Man's also like a really interesting character, because there's really two sides to him, right? You have Peter Parker and you've got Spider-Man. And I think, at least in my opinion, more than any other superhero that we see, it's really important that like both of his separate lives are good on their own, in my opinion, right? Where it's like Tony Stark, he's kind of Iron Man, like there's not really a double life. There is no, for the most part, there's no double life for him. But there is with Spider-Man. I think that Andrew Garfield overall is a better actor in these Spider-Man movies than Tobey Maguire. I think the acting is more consistently high. Not that Tobey Maguire's a bad actor or anything. I just think that for these films, I think the level of acting is consistently a little bit better with Andrew Garfield. But I also think that Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker, I'm not the biggest fan of it. It doesn't feel like Peter Parker to me. He's like a skater punk. and Andrew Garfield is too good looking and too cool to be kind of the dweeb, the nerd, that I feel like Peter Parker kind of is. And I think a great instance of this is when we kind of first see Peter Parker, and it's not Peter who's being picked on by, I believe it's Flash Thompson again.
It is.
Yep. Yeah. It's some other kid. And he's like holding the other kid upside down and like ducking his head in applesauce or something. Right. But to me, and then like Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker comes in and he's standing up, which is good characterization, but it doesn't quite feel like Peter Parker. It's like Peter's just like a pretty average kid in Mark Webb's, Spider-Man movies. I kind of like the nerdiness, the kind of loser vibe that Peter has in Raimi's Spider-Man movies a little better. What do you think?
Yeah, so I had that one too. I actually, that instance where he stands up to Flash, I liked that a lot, actually. I thought that was kind of cool that he's kind of already a hero because, it seems that's kind of a big leap. Like he gets, bit by a spider and gets new powers. And all of a sudden he also has a character change where he's brave and stands up to bad guys. And like, this is, as opposed to this version where, he's kind of willing, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He stands up to Flash and then pays the price for it. So I thought that was kind of a cool and surprising, addition to this. Cause usually you just see Peter getting picked on repeatedly. And here he's standing up for the smaller guy. I think, he is an outcast. I get where you're saying where it's a different characterization where he's not your typical nerd. He seems like almost like he's on the autism spectrum a little bit in certain aspects. I've noticed that where he's kind of has a trouble focusing on things outside of one particular thing, which I thought was interesting. But I thought there was some good indirect characterization with him though too, where in the Raimi trilogy, it's kind of like we're told that he's smart, right? He's a genius, but we get to see that I think a little bit better in this one. We talked about the web shooters, of course, and that he actually figures that out and develops the web fluid from some Osborn tech. But I also liked the scene with his uncle where he's figuring out the plumbing and just kind of having that knack for, for mechanical things, understanding how things work.
Right.
Seems like it'd be kind of a natural thing where, this is a guy who's really smart and here's some practical application of that. We see it in action before he's developing the spider tech and stuff. So I like that. I was like, let me show you what a smart guy he is.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you bring up some good points. And I hadn't thought about it that way, where in Webb's movies, Spider-Man, or I should say Peter Parker, has the personality of like, I need to stand up for other people, but he doesn't really have the strength to do so. So I actually kind of like that. Thinking about it from that perspective, I do like it better. I think for me, it's an interesting contrast, which Raimi kind of touches on, where you have someone who there is a drastic change where Peter Parker in Raimi's is very much like, oh, wow, I have all these powers now. How am I going to use them? And he kind of discovers, like, with the wrestling match and how Ben dies in Raimi's, it's like he's discovering like, okay, I have to use these powers responsibly. And I do feel like that's one of the weaknesses for me of Webb's, because first of all, the whole scene with Ben, I love Martin Sheen as Ben Parker. I think that's a great choice. And Ben and May, I think, are fantastic. I love the two of them and their interplay between those two and with Peter in Webb's trilogy. I think the scene where Ben dies, though, is kind of ridiculous. Like it's like Peter goes in, he doesn't have enough money for his milk, which random, but whatever. But it's like, if you don't have enough money for something, yeah, they're not going to let you buy it. And like the store clerk is not being super kind or whatever, right? But it's like, it's same thing. He doesn't have enough money. And then the robber comes in and, he runs out. And then the store shop guy, he's like, stop somebody. Hey, you stop him. And it's like, no average person is going to run after a shoplifter. Like, that's not their job. It's dangerous, right? But then when he trips and the gun falls out, right, in front of Uncle Ben like dives for the gun. But why? There's no reason to. Like, just get out of the way.
Right.
Like, don't mess around with something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel like, it's one thing where if Spider-Man or Uncle Ben is like trying to save somebody, right, where there's literal danger to somebody else and you put yourself on the line to protect someone else. But it's like, no, this is like just some cash. Like, that can be replaced. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And, that's one of my earlier thoughts I didn't quite mention yet, but I'll mention it here too, is, how soon is too soon for a reboot? It's 5 years between Spider-Man 3 and this one. And I was like, wow, that's really a short turnaround. And then of course, he's rebooted again only 2 years after Amazing Spider-Man 2 in Civil War. So 5 years is too soon, but 2 years is really, really soon. And so that's kind of an interesting thing of like, do we redo the scene? Like we talked about earlier that, with Cliff Robertson in the Raimi movies, that with great power comes great responsibility. All of that, they don't even touch that in this one. They kind of dance around it, which they also do in the Tom Holland version, because it's perfect, right? Don't mess with it. The Uncle Ben death is perfect. And they kind of mess with it in this one a little bit. They don't want to do it exactly the same. I do give them credit for the fact that it's almost like it's more Peter's fault in this version, because they just had an argument and like he wouldn't even be there at all. He's kind of running out there and he's desperate, to try and track down Peter. And so there's a little bit of a different angle, but yeah, the execution, no pun intended,
kind of cheesy. Like,
is kind of cheesy. I will say, I'm going to move us down to a little bit of cinematography real fast. Is that you have, when they walk into Oscorp, there's this giant looming hologram of Norman Osborn, kind of in profile, or silhouette rather, which I thought was interesting because they don't really have Norman Osborn in this movie, and he's barely in the second one. And so kind of contrasting what they did with Uncle Ben is like, they don't even touch Norman Osborn. Like, yeah. I had in my notes, like he's the Phantom Menace, to borrow a Star Wars reference, of these movies. He's just kind of floating in the background. He kind of drives the plot for number one, because we know Dr. Connors is working on something to kind of, fix him. He's got, Norman Osborn has a disease and he's mentioned a couple of times. But they're like, Willem Dafoe did such a great job. Let's not even have him in the movie. We just had the Green Goblin. Let's not retread all of that stuff.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but I like that point. It is interesting because you do have, you bring up a good point with the how long, or how soon is too soon for reboot, because I think Willem Dafoe is pretty iconic as Green Goblin. I mean, love him or hate him, I think a lot of people, that's his voice is cemented kind of as Green Goblin, because so many of us grew up watching, the Raimi trilogy and Green Goblin and Willem Dafoe's portrayal of him. So I think this movie's in a bit of a pickle a little bit. And it's one thing that I actually really like about the MCU Spider-Man is that they don't even bother with it. Like they completely skip over the origin story for Spider-Man. We know nothing about how the MCU origin might be different. I will say, for cinematography, my absolute 100% favorite shot is I'm forgetting the scientist's name from the first Amazing Spider-Man.
Dr. Connors.
Dr. Connors, yes.
Yeah.
First of all, I love the fact that he's missing an arm. Like, that's a perfect little motivational piece for that character, because it's like, it makes total sense why he's trying this whole reptilian like regrowth thing. And there's one shot where there's like a glass, I think it's glass or maybe a mirror, and he's like reaching out and he can see like both, like the reflection of both of his arms, right? And it's such a beautiful little piece of camera work to get that perfectly, where you can see both his real arm and his chopped off, but like the pale reflection of his other arm. But what I love, again, is just that it has that motivation. I feel like so many superhero movies fall into this trap of, we're going to be evil for the sake of being evil. And Dr. Connors has this very, real personal motivation for doing this work. And it devolves a little bit, in my opinion, towards the end, where he's like, well, we're going to improve the human race and all. And it falls into that generic super villain spiel. But I think it's such a strong beginning that I don't mind it too much. And I love the fact that we get that non-verbally. We get that just visual, even from the very beginning.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I had that written too. I thought that was a fascinating shot, and you can see on his face, like he's, if only I could do this, that there is, this, again, we talked about indirect characterization of what he's, yep. And we're getting to very much read his thoughts.
Yes.
In that scene. My favorite shot is actually really sad, but it is the Gwen Stacy in profile when she hits the ground.
I love that one too,
because they show it just so you can actually see the very moment when her head hits. And that, along with, just to kind of go down to sound for just a second, is just a brutal. It's so quick, and it's a small sound, but the fact that you hear anything at all, you just know it's over.
Yeah. I had that as one of my favorites too. And that's exactly the word I used to describe it, was brutal. I talked about how I enjoyed the Raimi movies, how they brought that, it seemed like a higher level of action, right? At moments throughout the movies. And this was similar in that it was just a gut punch visually, with the audio. You kind of felt it. And that to me is some great movie work right there. Some film, a great moment where the visual and the audio work together to create a moment that is, you just feel it.
Yeah, I mean, number 2 has a lot of problems, but that's not one of them. Like that's, no. And I think that's part of why number 2 gets the reputation that it has, is that it has these moments of greatness. I love the end too, where he steps in, puts his hand on the little kid dressed as Spider-Man and like takes over. It's such a great, there's some really good highs in this movie.
Yeah.
And some definite lows, which just is horrible. I also really like, I do want to mention too, that I really liked how the color is a little bit more muted. We talked about it. It's less cartoony a little bit. And that's kind of the feel. It's more grounded, less campy in this one. And I really like my favorite. I don't know if it's my favorite shot. My favorite shot is the one where Gwen Stacy hits. But I also really like this sequence that it's in first person, where the first time you kind of get the reveal of the costume, where it looks like he just like strapped a GoPro to the top of his head, and then he hits the wall. Like, I wish there would be more scenes like that, where it's like, no, I'm Spider-Man in the audience. I'm getting to do these things and swing through the buildings and land on the skyscraper. I just thought that was just a great kind of out of nowhere. There's not a ton of it in these films, but I thought it was a really powerful moment.
I actually didn't like the first person. It just
hey, that's fine.
No, but I love the imagery and I like of him with the reflection of Spider-Man. And I love what you just said about, hey, we're all Spider-Man, because thematically, I think that's where Spider-Man's most powerful. But to me, it just felt too jerky. Like I don't know. Wasn't personally a fan, but I love the intent behind it. What did you think of the web slinging from the duology compared to Raimi's?
I thought it took a massive leap forward. I thought it was great. It felt uh it felt less CGI. Clearly it is, because
Right.
it's not a guy, it isn't a stuntman doing that. But it felt more photorealistic and it felt more visceral because of that. So I really liked it. I thought it was a big leap forward. That was one thing that I noticed right away. First time I saw Amazing Spider-Man was, wow, I really like the web swinging, especially through traffic and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think it's a lot better too. And I think part of that's probably the technology where the CGI looks more real. And so it feels a little more real. And what did you think about the suits? Talking about costumes real quick. Um, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man costume versus Andrew Garfield's.
Well, I'm on record from our last episode as saying that it was a massive leap in believability that Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man would be able to make that suit, and we never even get him making it. He just shows up and he's wearing that.
Yeah.
Versus this one, it's very grounded, right? He's literally cutting the lenses out of a pair of sunglasses.
Yeah.
And researching, and which is pretty funny. Always spandex. Just trying to find something that he can put together. So it kind of has a little bit of a homemade feel to it, but it's also fairly cool. And then they have the massive redesign for the second one with just the giant eyes and no explanation of how he got that. And that's fine. I bet he was still doing some research. He's still using Bing. I think it's Bing. Some product placement, product placement to find another way to do that. This is kind of a random aside, but I like what they do this in Batman Begins as well, right? Where I'm going to research how to put my costume together. So I like seeing that stuff. I think that's kind of a fun, grounded take on superheroes, especially street level ones that are starting out, don't have a lot of money.
Yeah. I love the research, like you said, of putting a costume together. And we see that in Raimi's to an extent, the design anyway. I think the Spider-Man costume from Spider-Man 2 looks better, visually speaking, on film. Amazing Spider-Man 1 costume, I don't think it looks that good. I think it's a little bit more believable, like you said, a little bit more grounded, but I don't think it looks great. And I like Raimi's Spider-Man costume quite a bit. I will say though, I think that not Norman Osborn, his son
Harry.
I don't know why I'm blanking on that.
Yeah, no worries.
His costume towards the end is not good. No, it's really bad. I don't like it at all. What are your thoughts?
Well, it answers my gripe about the Goblin mask, right? But it's also kind of feels disjointed.
Yeah,
a little bit. He's got Dane DeHaan has a very expressive face as well. He can do that very, very wide grin, and I think that I get where they were going with that. And I appreciated the fact that they let him be expressive in that, but it does feel kind of halfway between a couple of different things.
Yeah. It just feels half-baked to me, where it's like, okay, I do see where you're going, but it didn't get there. Electro, I think, looks much better. It's pretty CGI heavy and stuff, but it's like, okay, I get it.
Yeah, see, I didn't like Electro's costume at all. I thought it was like an X-Men reject. Was kind of how that works. You get these jumpsuits. Didn't really. I mean, I get where they're going, because the costume for the comic version of Electro is extremely campy, and probably wouldn't look very good on film. But they went so far the other way, which in what we've seen so far from his appearance in No Way Home, they're kind of bridging those two things.
And that's where I'm like really interested, because with these 3 runs, essentially Spider-Man, you can see how they're kind of building off of each other a little bit, where they're taking what a little bit from the previous one, tweaking things, changing a little bit. We talk about the costume, and we haven't talked about Tom Holland's Spider-Man yet, but like they take that homemade costume to the extreme, and Holland's. And so you can kind of see where things are kind of progressing, and they're a little different. I think with Garfield's Spider-Man, I think you mentioned that it was a little bit more grounded. To me, it feels more like a modern film, where Raimi's movies felt very grounded in the 90s. You have these like tonal jumps, which we talked about, like where the random horror movie pops in. You don't have that, right? In Webb's Spider-Man. It feels a little more tonally consistent. It also feels less goofy. I don't want to say less childish, but it feels more grown up, more modern. You mentioned how it's a little desaturated, right? The colors are a bit more muted. I think that that's a little more the case even in the Holland movies for the MCU, where things are a little bit more toned down, a little bit more muted. And so you have this interesting progression from the first Spider-Man movies to the most recent ones, where these things are kind of changing as they go.
So I want to touch on what you said about the cheesiness factor of the Webb movies, and how, for the most part, they're more grounded. And I think that's probably why I hate Electro's theme. I'm going to move down to sound a little bit, because that seems to be, it's so jarring. It's really, it sounds like something like the Riddler's theme almost out of Batman Forever. And that was another thing, that the first movie, Amazing Spider-Man, James Horner does the theme, and I actually liked his theme a lot. I thought it was great, and he's done a lot of awesome scores. Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, so many good scores. I did a lot of stuff for James Cameron, of course, Avatar and Titanic, Aliens, great stuff, right? So he does, and has a really interesting theme. I liked his theme. I actually like it better than Elfman's theme, and I know you're more of a fan of Elfman's theme than I am, and that's fine. And then we change it up, and we have, what they called this super group. And I love Hans Zimmer, but I did not like this score at all for Amazing Spider-Man 2. Yeah. It sounds like a TV theme song. It reminds me a lot of the
cheap.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like the Supergirl on the CW. That's what, and like some people like that theme. That's fine. But it does sound cheap. It sounds like a TV theme. And then all of a sudden you've got this just really weird kind of bouncy, goofy Electro theme, which they tweak a little bit when the transformation happens. But even that, it's like, yeah, it's still lame. And it just, we've talked about with sound, and how just changing the music in one scene completely changes the tone. And I think if we would have had a more consistent, mature score, that movie would probably have been received a little bit better, because I really feel like it hits you emotionally. All right, this is cheesy. And it doesn't necessarily match what you're seeing. Yeah. Although Jamie Foxx is acting in a completely different movie than everybody else. I'm not sure what happened there. The direction, maybe, I don't know. Maybe he's doing his own thing. I don't know. But it takes me out of the film really quickly. He's talking to himself. It's just weird.
And that's where I struggle, because I feel like it's actually an interesting idea, because they're clearly trying to show that Electro is kind of off his rocker. Like, he is not all there. And I actually feel like it may be inelegant, but it's at least effective. You very clearly understand that he is not 100% there. It's, I don't know. I think Jamie Foxx's acting was just fine. I don't think the script did him any favors. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's where it's like, I think me going in expecting it to be bad, I was more forgiving of some of the, not so great parts, where it's just like, that kind of met my expectations. But also there were moments, especially towards the beginning, that I felt worked quite well. And so it just feels like you said, where it's like there's some parts that are great, and then some parts that are just not good. But like one of the parts that I really enjoyed, jumping back to cinematography a little bit, is just the montage at the beginning of Amazing Spider-Man 2. Right after Gwen Stacy breaks up with him, which I also think is actually a pretty good scene, where she goes, "You can't keep doing this to me. I break up with you."
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, you go. Like, that's fair.
Right.
And then he is just doing Spider-Man stuff. And for like 3 minutes or something, it's just him saving people. It's him doing stuff. I love how he has a cold and he's in the.
Yeah.
So it's like, that right there is fantastic. That's good character work into some good stuff. And I have to mention, because I mentioned I love Aunt May and Ben Parker a lot more in this duology. And some of the jokes, I don't know, they really worked for me. So when Peter's trying to do the laundry and Aunt May is like, no, I do the laundry in this house. And she says, last time you did it, you turned everything blue and red. And of course, we know why that is. And Peter says, that was a mistake because I washed the American flag. And she goes, no one washes a flag. And it's like,
yeah. Good cover.
Yeah.
Because what else is red and blue?
But see, it's like little corny things like that. It's like it works. There's a little bit of humor, and so it's like, I think it's just more disappointing that the bad parts are pretty bad.
Yeah.
Because there is some good in there too.
It's interesting because I think the first movie worked pretty well and it did decent money.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like they've changed a lot of stuff for the second one. When you change the composer, that's one thing. You change the costume, change the it's like they get a lot of studio notes. I'm assuming they did because they're very much trying to fast track a Sinister Six movie in the second one, right? So they're like, we got to set all this stuff up, and we've seen this time and time again in superhero movies where they overload things, and it typically doesn't work out very well. And it's like you just have, it's not just one person's vision too. You have multiple people and all their different influences. It doesn't always shake out that well. And it felt like the second movie had a lot more people kind of pulling on it in different directions. And that's probably why you get tonal shifts and
too many cooks in the kitchen.
Too many cooks. Yeah. I do want to talk about sound just real fast before we've done a performance. I mentioned I also had it written as a wet smack when Gwen hits the ground. Just brutal. I'm just kidding. It's horrible. I love my favorite fight in all the Spider-Man movies is the Lizard and Peter-Man and Spider-Man fighting in the library, where you don't get to hear the fight. You hear the classical music as Stan Lee, one of his best cameos, is in there in the background, and it's just brilliant use of no sound, special effect wise, but using the classical music instead. And I also like that Peter's cell phone is the 67 Spider-Man theme.
Yeah,
that's fun. And then of course they throw in the Itsy Bitsy Spider, and he says, "I hate that song," which is pretty awesome too.
Yeah, the little Easter eggs and jokes are, I think, overall pretty good in this series. I do love that Stan Lee cameo though. that's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
honestly, he's a lot of the Stan Lee cameos in the Spider-Man movies are pretty good.
Yeah. So performance, we talked a little bit about Andrew Garfield already. I also wanted to mention, I think he's a much better crier than Toby.
He is.
And this,
not even a competition.
No, this is a brutal series for him. It is.
Yeah.
He has a lot of tragedy that happens to him in these two films. And so he gets a lot of opportunity to do that. And you just, I feel for him. He talks really fast. No, Uncle Ben. And it's like, it just feels authentic. Like I'm there with him. I think Andrew Garfield's a fantastic actor, and they put him through the ringer in this one, and then Gwen dies, and it's just, oh man, just brutal. And I think Emma Stone is fantastic in these two films as Gwen Stacy. I think they have great chemistry. I think she's a good match for him. She's smarter than he is, and he knows it and relies on that, which is great. And then again, going back to the end of the second movie, he's telling, no, you got to leave. And she's like, nobody tells me what to do. I make my own choices. And then it happens.
Actions have consequences.
They do. But I can go back to, how in the Raimi trilogy that Peter Parker he's not funny and doesn't talk smack to criminals. And it's because of Amazing Spider-Man that I feel that way. When he has the thing with the car thief, my weakness, it's small knives. That whole sequence. It's like, you think I'm a cop in a skin tight red and blue suit? I was going for the guys who do the luge. I mean, he just can't stop talking the whole time, which is just amazing. Another line that I really like, Dennis Leary plays Gwen Stacy's dad. And I've just always been a fan of Dennis Leary. I think he's amazing. And he's toned down quite a bit. He's in the pocket in this, but he has a line where he says, "So 38 of New York's finest versus one guy in a unitard." Just brilliant.
Yep. I love the exchange between Captain Stacy and Peter Parker. Once Peter understands the plan, Dr. Connor's plan, and he like goes to the police and he's like, "You got to believe me."
Yeah.
And the acting for Captain Stacy, Dennis Leary, is spot on. Where it's like you can't quite tell at the beginning, is he going to buy it? Is he not? And then it's just like not even close.
Yeah.
So I think that I think his acting is spot on. Like you said, I love Emma Stone. I love Ben and May. Dr. Connors. I think the acting is just really solid. I think the only one who isn't really hitting it for me is Dane DeHaan in the second one. And the exchange between him and his father, so between Harry and Norman Osborn, is just like, whew, that feels like out of a different movie. Like,
yeah,
it just isn't working. The interactions between Harry and the other characters, it just doesn't quite sell it for me. And that's where I feel like, as much as Electro is cheesy, I think Jamie Foxx is selling what he's getting. It's not great stuff, but he's doing his best. I don't think Dane DeHaan is. And Paul Giamatti feels a little out of place.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like the right, it feels miscast to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because I like Paul Giamatti and just about everything I've seen him in, but it doesn't feel like he's the right guy for that part.
No, it feels like they really needed someone different. So it's kind of like the core cast, I think, is rock solid, right? And I do think it was really interesting. I love the choice that they made to have Captain Stacy appear in these like little flashbacks, I guess you'd call them, in Amazing Spider-Man 2, trying to deal with some of this PTSD, right? And I love when movies do this where, consequences for your actions, it goes for everybody. Peter is still a person, right? He still has to deal with the ramifications of being Spider-Man. And the fact that he's really torn up about Captain Stacy dying, I think is a really interesting choice, because it forces him to kind of reconcile. Am I Spider-Man? Am I Peter? Can I be both? And I think both series deal with that in their own way. And I really enjoy that.
Yeah, I thought that was a really powerful thing that they did in this movie, in these two movies, where first off, you get Gwen Stacy finding out that he's Peter pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I love that scene where he says, "I've been bitten," and she's like, "So have I." And it's it's like classic sitcom misunderstanding. But he's like, "No, I'm trying to tell you I got bit by a radioactive spider," and she's like, "Oh, you're in love with me." And yes, both are true.
Yeah.
But she has this exchange with him where she talks about how since she's been a little kid, she's been worried about her dad coming home, and it's she's going to have to deal with that with him, and it comes true with her dad, and so Peter's all that he's been told, like if I get involved with you, like I'm putting you at risk, I'm putting everybody at risk. And so, but he does it anyway. So it's natural that he would have this kind of survivor's guilt,
right,
from that. But like, what other choice does he have? I mean, so I thought that was, again, and this is in the second movie too. So there's so many great moments in the second movie, guys.
Yeah. And that's where that's what I mean by like I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, because it's like, oh, and a lot of that PTSD stuff, that survivor's guilt, is nonverbal. Like you just sees Captain Stacy in all these different places, right? And yeah, he talks about it, but to begin with, it's like we get a view, we see the world from Peter Parker's perspective. And I think that's always an important piece of storytelling in general, is you have to, connect with the character in the sense of you see a little bit of the world from their point of view, or at least you can see it. You can imagine yourself in their shoes. And that's where I really do like the relationship between Gwen and Peter. I think it really works. You mentioned that they have chemistry. I think they work really well together. I would say the relationship between those two, Gwen and Peter, is a little better than the relationship between Mary Jane and Peter from Raimi's series. And partially because Mary Jane's a horrible person and Gwen is not.
Well, these two have things in common too, right? It's not just like, well, why are they together? Well, because they're the male lead and the female lead. That's how it works. It's like, no, they have a lot in common. Like they both love science. They're both very smart. They've kind of known each other for a little while. And
right.
So it feels like a natural extension of who these characters are.
It kind of feels like a real relationship.
Yeah. Good job, guys. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to mention for performance before we move on to setting and design?
I will say this, because I wasn't a huge fan of Peter's parents in these movies. It's fine. It doesn't quite. Part of me says like it doesn't matter. Peter's parents don't matter, and it's like harsh to say, but it's not about Peter's parents. It's about Peter. And so, they spend this time on his parents, which feels more out of like a James Bond film than a superhero film. And I just feel like, I don't know. I feel like they could have spent that time, and talk about performances. It was acted fine and stuff. I just feel like, I don't know if they did that just to be different, because Peter's parents don't really show up in much of any Spider-Man media, as far as I know. I wasn't the biggest fan of that, but not the end of the world either.
Okay. I do have one question about that real fast. Have you seen the deleted scene from the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2?
No.
Okay, because there is one that's on the Blu-ray where Peter's dad shows up at the cemetery.
Oh.
Where Peter's been standing for. He clearly hasn't been standing for 6 months, but that's the way it looks, and that's a beautiful shot where him just kind of in profile and the seasons change or whatever. But yeah, his dad shows up, and so there's possibly some a story thread that we're going to continue into.
Sure.
Amazing Spider-Man 3 had that come to fruition.
Had that worked out, yeah.
So, other than in the cemetery, which is clearly a real-world location, I was interested to find that most of the first movie was filmed in and around Los Angeles, as opposed to the second movie, which most of it was actually in New York, like all over the place in New York. And they were very proud to say, hey, we filmed almost this entire thing in New York, which is great because that's where Spider-Man lives. And that's one of the things I would say that with the second movie is better than the first, because of just feeling grounded in outside buildings and those natural landmarks and stuff of New York. As far as set decoration goes, I really liked, my biggest thing is the giant clock where Gwen dies. Metaphor, people. It's metaphorical. She's running out of time. I was like, man, that's genius. I love those. It's kind of a clunky, over the top, on the nose, pick, whatever you want to say there. But I thought it was effective, and how it just keeps turning, the gear keeps turning, and that's what snaps the web. And so I just thought that was a powerful and kind of a cool thing for there.
Yeah. I don't know why, but it struck me when you're looking at like the rooms of these actors, right? Because they're all supposed to be like high school age, roughly. And it's like, man, their rooms are really cool. They got all sorts of stuff in there. It's like no room I've ever seen looks like that. I do think that I kind of like the sewers from the first Amazing Spider-Man. I think that it's kind of a good compromise between a more grounded, modern take on these movies, but still having kind of like a secret layer. It makes a lot of sense. It adds a little suspense because you can't always see Dr. Connors as kind of the crocodile. It also has the worst aspect of any of the two movies, which is the fact that Peter Parker has his name on the camera, which is how Dr. Connors finds out who Spider-Man is, which is just the stupidest thing. Because you even mentioned how, both Gwen and Peter are pretty intelligent in these films. That is not. That was really bad.
That was dumb.
And that just felt super contrived. But other than that, like, I mostly enjoy the scenes and stuff. I like the fact that he has web shooters. It's not just coming out of his skin. And it even there's a little bit of reasoning, because I mentioned for the Raimi trilogy how Spider-Man's web shooters would just randomly stop working. Not web shooters, but they would just stop.
Sure.
And in Amazing Spider-Man 2, when he's fighting Electro, they zoom in and they show the electricity hitting his web shooter, and it makes sense because it being an electronic device. So it's like, okay, he's kind of crippled in this fight. So it's like, I appreciate those little things that they included.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like seeing. I mean, it's like in the first Iron Man, just watching him work through stuff, trying to figure it out and exploding, and then in the second movie with the car battery, it just going horribly wrong. And see, for me, like, those are good moments of levity that don't take me out of the film. Like, that's okay. We can take a breath here and laugh at something being stupid without it being Jamie Foxx talking to himself, for instance. All right. Characters. Yeah, I thought most people did a pretty solid job with this. I also always enjoy Comfior. I think that's how you say his name. He's the guy who also played Laufey in the Thor movies. He plays Donald Mencken in this. He's barely in it. He's the guy that takes over Oscorp from Harry. He's always good. If you've ever seen, I don't know if you have you ever seen Storm of the Century? It's a Stephen King. It was a miniseries. He's the bad guy in that. I highly recommend that. And to anybody who's listening, Storm of the Century is fantastic. And you might have to find it somewhere, but it's on DVD, I know, at least. I also like that at least a mention. Jameson gets a mention.
Yeah,
because he's cheap.
I remember that too.
He's cheap, which is awesome, because that's what we know from
the line is like, if Jameson or the Bugle didn't pay you like starvation wages or something, and he's like, they wouldn't be starvation wages in the 60s. It's like,
yeah, that's a nice pull too, right? It's like, hey, that's when Spider-Man came out, was invented. So yeah, so that's probably another thing where like, what we don't want to touch,
right? Well, you can't.
Yeah,
he is the pinnacle of acting in any superhero movie. It doesn't get any better than J. Jonah Jameson.
Yeah, J.K. Simmons is a genius. So they just left it there. That's good. We'll just assume it's the same one. Because of course it is, because it is in the Holland multiverse version.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure he's always the same. All right. As far as Hero's Journey goes, I mean, it hits all the beats, clearly. Death of the Mentor with Uncle Ben. We can argue about whether or not Peter needs to become more of a hero or is better off kind of being a hero at the beginning. Whatever. It fits.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Final transformation. And then he, accepts the call at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2 again, which is, I think, one of the highlights of that movie as well.
Yeah.
All right. So final thoughts on the Amazing Spider-Man duology.
I think it's a good run. Some obvious problems in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and more than anything, it just feels unfortunate, because I feel like, as we've been talking about for the last hour or so, there are some really good points in that film. In some ways, it feels like it feels both finished and unfinished to me, because I think the death of Gwen Stacy, there's the sense of finality about it. But at the same time, it also kind of feels like the Empire Strikes Back a little bit, where, there's this big down note and there's no triumphant rise at the end. There's no Return of the Jedi moment for Garfield's Peter Parker, where it's like, it feels like there could have been another story to go after this. And I think there was talk about having another one. I think if 2 had been a bit more of a solid movie, maybe we would have gotten that. I don't know. But, I think for what it is, I think they're enjoyable films that I was pretty happy to come back and revisit.
Yeah, I agree. I think the best way to look at it is, like you'd mentioned earlier, with like different comic book runs, where whatever Spider-Man is your favorite version is fully legitimate. And there's no, well, the new one, they rebooted it now, and so the other ones don't count. Like, that whole mentality is fortunately, it's going away. If you enjoyed the movie, great. If you didn't, leave it on the shelf and don't watch it. I'm hoping, and he keeps protesting, saying he's not in the movie. And I'm trying to temper my expectations, but I really want Andrew Garfield to be in No Way Home. I really do hope that he's in there. I hope he and Toby are both in there, and that we get a little bit of resolution to kind of this. There's not really lingering plot threads, but I kind of want to know like what happened to him after. As I said earlier, he's my favorite Spider-Man, so I'd like to see him be Spider-Man some more.
Yeah. For what it's worth, and for the future, this is before we have seen No Way Home, but somebody on something, I want to say it was like IMDb, or it was some theater website, said that it was starring Garfield in No Way Home. And maybe that's a mistake. Maybe somebody made that up. I don't know. But somebody pointed out in the trailer for No Way Home that Tom Holland's MJ, played by Zendaya, is falling, very similar to Gwen Stacy. And I would bet just about anything that Andrew Garfield Spider-Man is going to have a little PTSD flashback, but is going to save her this time.
Please, yes.
And that will be a little redemptive piece right there. And I really hope that's the case, because I do like Garfield Spider-Man too.
Yes, let's do that. Yes, please. Hey, before we get out of here, we got an email from Joshua Cox. It's a lovely email. And I'm going to go ahead and read it because it's just great. And he kind of rips on you at the end, Matt. So that's fun. Not really. He doesn't really rip on you, but he does call you out. All right. Here's what it says. Dear Reading Between the Reels. Hello. May I first say I love your podcast. I just recently discovered it from the recent episode of Coffee with Kenobi you appeared on. See, it worked. Look at that. We were on there. More people heard us. That's me talking, Craig, now. Your podcast is great. I'm really passionate about storytelling, film especially. I especially love hearing you guys talk about cinematography and technical aspects like that. It's hard to find podcasts that actually address that branch of it, and I'm glad I found such a great one. Thank you guys, and keep it up. I'm a little late to the game on this, but I just recently finished your Rise of Skywalker episode and wanted to share some of my thoughts. I agree with just about everything you guys said, and I just wanted to add a bit. I share your feelings about Rey Palpatine. I don't like it at all. Structurally, it's an ineffective midpoint. At the midpoint, the plot takes a turn we didn't expect, and or the stakes, both literally and emotionally, are raised. The Rey Palpatine reveal was supposed to be the midpoint, but nothing is changed. The plot is unaltered. The goals, motivations, and emotional stakes of the characters are completely the same. No character is changed by this revelation, and no elements of the plot are either. I wish this was a video podcast, because Matt is nodding repeatedly. Secondly, it fails Rey as a character. Her whole arc in The Last Jedi was learning to define herself rather than relying on other people to define her. It was about learning that she is special because she is Rey, not because she's Rey Palpatine or Rey Kenobi or anyone else. Rey Palpatine does somewhat follow up on this, but nobody accomplishes this theme so much better. Rey Palpatine does allow for her to realize that blood does not define her, but it still puts her in a box. It essentially says that the only reason she's important and has a part in this story is because she's Palpatine's granddaughter, instead of simply because she's Rey and because of what she chooses to do. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you so much for your podcast and keep it up. P.S. My favorite Ghostbusters quote is from Peter. Sorry, Matt. Back off, man. I'm a scientist. Joshua Cox. Thank you, Joshua. That was awesome.
Yes, you are clearly a gentleman and a scholar. You mostly agree with us, which is fantastic.
It's okay if you don't, as long as you listen and let us know.
In some ways, it's sometimes it's fun when people don't, because get good discussion. But frankly, I really agree with your comments on Rise of Skywalker, and it is so disappointing. And I am happy to talk about Rise of Skywalker anytime anyone brings it up, because there's a loathing that I have for that movie that is hard to describe. But the fact that you bring up that, like, the whole Rey Palpatine is this like surprise, but then it doesn't fundamentally change anything, is a horrible sin. Because it's like, if you're going to do the whole Rey Palpatine thing, okay, do it, but do it well. Like, have it mean something, and I feel like it feels like a throwaway in some sense. It's kind of like somehow Palpatine returned, just tossing it out there. So thank you for writing, Joshua. Great thoughts. And I do agree with you. And it's fun hearing some other people's thoughts about this movie, knowing that we're not alone.
Absolutely.
So as we close, we just want to say thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook, email us at readingbetweenreels@gmail.com, or use the SpeakPipe app on our website.
If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast catcher. We'd love to hear your feedback, and it really helps get the word out about the podcast. And if you haven't yet, please join our Facebook group. It's a safe place to share your thoughts and discuss all things related to movies.
And one last thing. Our next episode will be a review of The Matrix. Send us an email or voicemail about your favorite moments in The Matrix, and we'll share them on the next episode.